All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. This is Stephen King Rules. In this episode, we are talking about the 1979 miniseries Salem's Lot, which is over 3 hours long. And on my old podcast, Horror Heads, which I will post a link to to this episode that I'm going to reference here in the description below. But we talked about this movie on there years ago, and I hadn't reread the book before we did the movie. And I remember, and I shouldn't say I remember, when we did that episode, one of the things that I had said was, this is a 3 hour movie, and it feels every bit of a 3 hour movie. So,
it does.
But anyway.
It really does.
Yeah, it really, really does. But we're talking about the 1979's miniseries, and the reason why I do say miniseries is because I kind of think that is a little important to think of when you're watching it, just in the aspect that it's not really a 3 hour feature-length film, that this was a miniseries that ever since then has been just put into like a one movie form, made into one movie, whatever. The same thing they did with the It miniseries, which is almost like 10 years after this. So, which was well before your time too. But before we get into the adaptation, I wanted to just touch on the book real quick, because again, rereading this one, because last month we talked about Carrie, which just so happened to be Stephen King's first novel. This one, the second novel. But Stephen King, he had this really, I shouldn't say bad habit, but when I was reading this book and it got over with, the first thing I thought, it was like, man, if Stephen King keeps this ending habit of his going, like by the time you get to the third or fourth book, there's not going to be any towns left in Maine, because that's how he's in the stories, is he just destroys the towns.
Just obliterates them. I know. I think this is his favorite book that he's written. I could be wrong on that.
I think I've heard that too.
This is his favorite. This is not my favorite Stephen King book, but
when I was reading this one, because this movie, well, so did, I guess, Carrie, when I looked that up too, technically I think Carrie came out after I was born, so I was alive when both of those came out. But when I was watching this one the other day, it made me think of the It miniseries. And I remember when that came out when I was a kid. And then I was thinking back then about, like, because when that came out, I would have been like 13 years old or so. And I was a Stephen King fan at that time. But then I was trying to remember, like, oh man, when did I get into Stephen King? And I don't know if this is my actual first encounter with him or not, but I seem to remember when I was like in 6th grade, I got a library card, and it was like either like an adult library card or like an unrestricted library card or something, like, and it must have been when I turned 13. Would that? No, that wouldn't. I would have been older than that. But maybe it was when I turned. Maybe it was even younger than that. Maybe it was when I was 10. I don't remember now. But anyway, I remember I got this library card that I could check out whatever I wanted to then, without having to like have my mom come with me and stuff. And I remember checking out the paperback version of Pet Sematary, mainly because it had like a cool, like the cool like cat thing on the cover and stuff. And I don't remember reading the book at all, but I remember like getting it. And then I was trying to remember like what my first like movie experience was, and I think it was I almost want to say it was like similar. It was like probably like It or Pet Sematary, like around the same time frame, maybe. But I don't know if that's true or not. Do you remember what your first book was that you ever read of Stephen King's?
I think my first book was Carrie. It was either Carrie or The Shining.
Either one of those would be.
But I know Well, I think the first book of his that I tried to pick up was when I was like 12 or 13, and it was It. And I remember I like opened it and I was like, man, I can't fucking do this. Because that is such a long book, and it is such classic Stephen King, where it's just so slow in the beginning and there's so many characters and so much going on. But the first book I remember reading, I believe it was Carrie, and I was
Yeah.
hooked.
Yeah, I think that was probably my first experience too. When if I did read Pet Cemetery, if I tried to read Pet Cemetery, when I think I checked it out from the library, I don't think there's any way I would have been able to comprehend it, at all. Like if I read it, like I wouldn't have really, like, I
Yeah.
don't know what's going on with these characters and stuff. Because that, like, when you look at, like, to, like, I didn't do that on purpose, but to, like, to bring that back to this, the Salem's Lot story, that is one of the things, like, in this book that Stephen King really starts to do is, like, you didn't really get it so much in Carrie, because Carrie was a fairly short book, but this one was, I don't know, is it 600 and some pages or something? Um,
Yeah.
but I read it on my Kindle, so I mean, it's hard to tell him. You don't have that when you're not reading the real book, and you don't have that, like, oh, that's a Stephen King book. Like,
Yeah.
but this one, it's really one of the first books of his, I think, that he really does the character development and stuff, which is kind of becomes a defining characteristic of a Stephen King story, like of one of the longer
Yeah.
ones, where he has just all of this character for development, and a lot of times you're like, man, I don't care about half of these. Why are you telling me all of this stuff? And then it comes to play later on in the story, which even though this movie ended up being 3 hours long, and they do a good job of touching on a lot of that, there's no way you're ever going to get any of, like, all of what Stephen King does in a book with all
Yeah.
the different character development in a movie form. There's just no way. Unless, I mean,
No.
nowadays, like, maybe you can do it if you were to do, like, the whole, which they kind of are doing that already with some of the Stephen King stories, but turning them into, like, these series and stuff. And then where, so
That's
instead of
true.
it just being like a 3 hour thing or whatever, you can devote 10 or 12 hours to it over multiple seasons, even if, which they're doing. I think the Institute's doing that, and then Welcome to Derry's doing that and stuff. So,
Oh man, I love Welcome to Derry.
but yeah, that's what you need, because, again, like, not only the character development, but even, like, not so much in this one, but a little bit in this one, where Stephen King, at least for me, like, Stephen King always has this knack for, he has his main characters, but then he also has the secondary characters, whether he's doing it on purpose or not. There's always ends up being one or more of the secondary characters that you end up, like, kind of, like, caring about as much or more than
Yeah.
sometimes than the main characters of the stories. I mean, I give you, we've talked about this before, but I don't know about on here. This is only second episode,
Yeah.
I guess. But Holly Gimby is the perfect example of, that
Yep.
secondary character that all of a sudden is not necessarily everybody. I know she's for a lot of Stephen King's fans, she's like a bleh. But, like, for me, and I think you too, like,
That's
she's my
crazy.
favorite character. And
Yes.
I believe that she is Stephen King's favorite character as well. I mean, I would assume so. He keeps writing about her. I think he's writing another book about her or something. So,
I do love Holly. He just, yeah, I've never had another author that I've read a book by who writes characters quite like he does, to where they are so tangible. Like, you read Holly Gibney and you're like, she could be a person. You could take her out of a book and she could be a fully developed, fully formed person right next to you. But yeah, he definitely started to do that in Salem's Lot. And I would agree. I feel like somehow they compressed some of the plot and character development, even though it is 3 hours long and it feels so long.
yeah, that is the one bad part about this particular adaptation. And I think I mean, honestly, if I was to pick it apart, I think this is really the only negative thing about it is the length of it, and it's not even so much as the length
Yeah.
of it, because I think, well, what's the It movies? The two of them together are like what 5.5 hours long or something.
Yeah.
It's not so much the length; it's the like you said it when you're watching this movie and you're like, okay, now we're like an hour and 2 hours,
The the
2.5 hours.
pacing
It
is
just it
just poorly
feels it.
done.
Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
it was because it was probably made for TV that it was in the 70s,
Yeah.
that that's part of the of that, just because they were maybe trying to fill time. I don't know, but yeah, there's a lot of it that's just like it feels long. I mean, it
Yeah.
feels long, and uh, it definitely, when you look at it now, not that it's a bad movie, but it's definitely aged kind of. I don't want to say poorly, but again, a lot of it is just a product of its time, being that it came out in the late 70s and stuff. I mean, bell bottoms were the thing, and that weird like dog flop haircut that the guys wore. Like the what do they call it? Like the dog ear haircut or whatever that they had and stuff. Like, and it just looks dated and stuff.
Yeah. I feel like it looks and feels dated, but it doesn't feel nostalgic.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's not something this movie in particular is not a movie that I would necessarily like rewatch regularly.
no, I don't.
No. Me and Alex watched it together and he goes, "It's been 10 minutes and no one has even said anything." He goes, "How long is this?" And I said, 3 hours. And he goes, "Oh no."
I
But
think this, and again, this is a thing that we talked about this quite a bit on my old podcast. Was if this would have been one of those movies that you watched when you were a kid for some
mm,
reason, you know, like if it would have been like your first introduction to horror, or your first introduction to vampires or something, like I could see then like you like, oh yeah, I really love that movie and stuff,
mm,
because I definitely have movies like that from my childhood that are like that, that I watch all the
yeah.
time and stuff. And a lot of people are like, ugh. And then when you look at it, you stand back and look at it, you're like, oh yeah, that's not a good movie at all, but for some reason I like it. Night of the Comet is
That
one of
was
those. Like if Night of the Comet is on, I will watch it. And it's a horrible movie, and like I don't know anybody else that likes that movie, and I love that movie.
that's me in the 2017 adaptation of It. I was 16 when that came out and I love that movie. And the CGI is so bad and like there's something about it. People pick that movie apart. Not me. That is one of my comfort movies. If I'm sick, that's on TV. And
So the
Alex
only
is
way
like,
I
not
would like
again.
the It movies is if it's edited into the right order. Like if there is a fan edit to where they put it in the order that the book is, and then it's better. But the
I
just
have
watching all the
not
kid
seen
stuff
that.
it's like
See,
it's
and
the
I
whole
don't I
thing.
don't really like the second movie. I don't really like the second movie. It's just the first one. But yeah, this adaptation of Salem's Lot is definitely not one of my comfort movies.
No, yeah, it is very long, and it unfortunately it feels like it too. So the one thing I didn't realize, which I guess makes kind of sense, because again, t- hate to keep going back to the It miniseries, but they did a similar thing, which makes sense because this was a miniseries for TV. So a lot of the people that were in it were like,
Mm,
at the time, I guess, were like kind of well known actors and stuff, and because the guy that played Ben Mears in here,
mm.
what's his name? I had it right here. David Soul. He was like, I guess he was like a heartthrob at the time and stuff. But like now, like none of like I didn't know who he
Oh,
was going into it. Yeah, I'm like, oh, I don't know who this guy is. But the It miniseries kind of did the same thing. Like a lot of those people were not like movie stars or anything, but they were like well known for other things and stuff. But again, now when you watch, like, go back and like watch that, you don't like you wouldn't necessarily know that Bill is actually played by John Boy from the Waltons. You wouldn't know that. I know that because
Yeah.
I'm older, but it's the same thing. But that's with this though. I mean, this came out when I was a little kid, and now that I'm all grown up and stuff and watch it, like none of those faces are familiar or anything to me. And the other thing about this movie that I think is probably one of the probably more well-known facts about it is the fact that Toby Hooper directed it. So this would have been his, I think, second movie.
Okay.
And when you look at the Martzen house, that does have a very similar feel to the house in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And then
Yeah.
again, like doing some research for this episode, I knew that Toby Hooper had directed the miniseries, but then when I was watching some stuff about it, and then I was like, then I kind of put two and two together, and I'm like, oh, that's why they kind of had the same feel, like you're in the house, and it feels like you're in the thing in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre house. But then, like one of the things I was talking about was saying that he had a bunch of leftover props after he used Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and so they used like a bunch of the same props, and so then I'm like, well, that's why it looked and felt the same. That's cool.
That's funny. Oh gosh.
Yeah. So I would say if anything, unless you're doing like a thing like we're doing, like where you're going through and you're like you have like I want to see what all the different adaptations are about and stuff, or you want to just be all caught up on Toby Hooper movies and make sure you've seen them all. Other than that, I there's not really a lot like you said. I can't really see myself ever like suggesting this movie to anybody to like, hey, go watch Salem's Lot. Like it's a decent.
Yeah.
The story's a decent vampire story and stuff, and it's an okay adaptation, but it just feels it's one of those adaptations though that even though it's a good adaptation or a good representation of the source material, it's really not that great of a movie.
Yeah, and I feel like whenever people are first getting into Stephen King and they ask me for recommendations, I have never once been like, you should read Salem's Lot. It's not that it's a bad story, but it's not my favorite. And I feel the same way about this movie. I don't know if I would ever recommend to anyone to go watch this movie unless like they really love vampire movies. And then maybe I would watch Nosferatu again over this. Which, honestly, I feel like Kurt Barlow, he did kind of look like Nosferatu in this movie.
Yeah.
And those yellow contacts are really scary.
Yeah, and I don't know if that was done on purpose or not, because in the book, he's not really described as being that way at all.
No.
Right?
No, not that I remember. Well, and he was I do know in the book, Barlow was very much, he was more of a Dracula vampire. He was smart and cunning, and in the movie, they just made him very animalistic. And I feel like that would be anything you're adapting from book to film, you have to change, to make it digestible to the audience. But I feel like that was one of the things where, like, I don't know, you kind of miss out on is that that development of his character and kind of the eerie, smart, well-spoken vampire we could have gotten. But I don't know if you can make that scary-ass yellow contact beaming eye creature smart and eloquent.
Yeah, and it's funny, too, because you always hear that part of the inspiration for Salem's Lot was Dracula and stuff. And I've always heard that Stephen King wanted to write, when he had the idea for it, that originally he was like, oh, what would happen if if Dracula was in like a city setting, like in New York or something, and Tabitha King, his wife, was like, no, that wouldn't work. What if he was in like, and they lived like in like Maine and stuff, and she was like, what if he was in like some rural town? and that's kind of where the idea came from. So, but to be inspired by Dracula and then to turn around and then to make the movie monster look like Nosferatu, which is a ripoff of Dracula, is kind of funny.
It's a little ironic, but I don't know.
But of course,
I
like,
think
speaking of Dracula, though, like the one that came out, was it last year, Nosferatu?
mm-hmm.
Did you ever see that one? The
The
one
new
where they made,
Nosferatu.
yeah, the one
Mm-hmm.
from the 2024 or whatever, and it's the one
Yeah.
where they made him, instead of making him look like Nosferatu, like everybody was expecting, they made him look how Dracula is described in the novel. So he looked like an
Yep.
old warrior from like the 1400s or whatever, with the big beard or the big mustache and stuff.
Yep.
And then everybody's like, ah, they're like, yeah, but that's how he's supposed to look.
I think that was one of the coolest things that has happened in like cinematic history lately is I feel like previews and commercials for movies nowadays give everything away, and not knowing what to expect Bill Skarsgård to look like going into that movie theater, that was great. Like the reveal was of Count Orlok was really great.
And that is an example of what we were just talking about too, of like when you do an adaptation and then you make the thing look how it's supposed to look, but then
Yeah.
at the time, because so many people were like, that's not Nosferatu, there were so many people that were pissed off that it didn't look like Nosferatu. And then like what's his face came out and he was like, yeah, because I made him look how he's supposed to look. Ugh.
That's a vampire movie that I would recommend over this one. That's another,
All right,
Alex doesn't watch a lot of horror movies, but every vampire movie I've seen to date, I've seen it with Alex. And he has not enjoyed a single one. So
he's not a vampire fan.
he's not a vampire fan, but I know. I'm like, you're missing out.
All right, well, we'll be back next month with what are we talking? We are going to be talking about, I think, The Shining next month, I believe.
Oh,
I'll have to double check. I have to look at the order because we're doing stuff in order. So I think The Shining.
We are doing our
I'm pretty
best.
sure The Shining came out before Cujo. So, but
I think you're right.
With whatever we're going to do next month. So just be sure to click on share, like, subscribe, do all that fancy stuff, and we will talk to you guys next time.